Well, it's a privilege to have the opportunity to address you today. I've been asked to give a presentation that is both scholarly and approachable, and I hope more than being scholarly and approachable, it'll actually be meaningful and significant to you. I hope you'll learn to delight in the nuance and tapestry of the narrative of the Bible and the crafted stories that have been shaped for us. I want to thank, of course, the Green family and the Green Collection for the opportunity to be here, and for all of those in the leadership team and the curators, particularly Carrie Summers and Jerry Pattengale, who've served as mentors in my life. This presentation is informed by scholarship, though I do not plan to cite the scholars that have informed all of my reflections here. I'll be talking about Saul, Jonathan, and David, and because King David is so important in the story of the Old Testament, many books have been written about him, and nearly countless articles have been written about him. I don't pretend to have read every one of them, though I have read most of those that have been published within the academic community. Please know that these scholars and their work will shape my presentation. In particular, the kernel ideas that I'll be sharing tonight are shaped by a close reading of the biblical text, which is informed by the work of Robert Alter. Also, another scholar by the name of David M. Gunn has done work in the first stories of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And another scholar that pointed my attention to King Saul's spear, which will be much of the focus tonight, is James Hoyle. Several of my students are here today. I wish to welcome them in particular. I would have to tell you all honestly, I offered them no extra credit for being here. I just told them if they wanted to pass my class, they had to be here. So we're glad that they're here, thankful that they are here, and really honestly, one of the greatest privileges of my life is the opportunity to mentor students. I was particularly thankful that a few former students walked in the door a little bit ago. They used to have to pay to come to my class, and here they're choosing to be here. So thank you, and thank you to all of the rest of you that are here. For the presentation, I'll be moving very quickly through the context of multiple stories. In front of you, you have a copy of the biblical text that's been photocopied for you, and if you don't have a copy, maybe you can look around and find another one. For the PowerPoints, as we go through them, you will not be able to write down the notes on the PowerPoints. If you're trying to take notes, if you'd like a copy of that, you can contact me separately. Today, I'm going to be talking about the person Saul, Israel's first king, his son and heir apparent to the throne, Jonathan, and the shepherd boy who becomes Israel's most celebrated king, King David. I assume those of you here know something of the story or stories associated with these three persons from the Bible. I'm going to be talking about them as characters in the story, since the story we receive about them is framed by the persons who have shaped these stories over time. That is, the framework within which these three stories and characters have come to us is complex and intriguing. I hope we will see it to be more complex than we might have been aware, and I hope that in our presentation tonight, in its complexity, we will be invited to read the Bible and the biblical text more carefully. Scholars call this section of the Old Testament, where the stories take place, the Deuteronomistic history. That includes the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Within the framework of 1st and 2nd Samuel, there are numerous layers of stories that have been brought together. I say layers of stories because there are elements to these stories that bear striking evidence that they've been written over time by more than one author, finally edited and shaped into the story that we now receive in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Very likely these stories have come to us through an oral tradition that was brought together in smaller written collections and then finally edited and collected into the version of the text that we have now in 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Deuteronomistic history. Within 1st and 2nd Samuel, there are two primary sets of narratives. Many persons who read the Bible might know only a few stories here or there. So some of you might know the story of David and Goliath, or some of you might know particular stories with Solomon, little bits and pieces of stories that take place. But really, in our reading tonight, I want to give an assessment for a complete reading of these stories and reading them across the chapters, where we can see things that take place in ways that we might have overlooked. Within the several portions of stories that make up the narrative about King David, scholars have identified two distinct sets of stories within the David story, and these two distinct sets of stories revolve around how David rises into the role of kingship, and the second story involves David's relationship with his sons and the family members and their attempts to take the throne from David. These two narratives in the scholarly tradition are known as the history of David's rise and the succession narrative. And the slide will show you the verses that are associated, the chapters that are associated with that. Today I want to talk about the narrative artistry and creative writing style that has come to us in the narrative of David's rise. So 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 5. In our world today, an author has an infinite number of pages that potentially could be used to narrate and characterize the persons within their story. Take, for example, the voluminous writing associated with the author J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series. Now, I did not complete a precise page count of the books associated with the Harry Potter series, though in an average paperback collection, based on my review, the series has more than 3,000 pages in the entire series narrating the characters in the Harry Potter series. Compared to this, the narrative that we have in the biblical text with David is extremely brief. Perhaps, depending on how you want to lay out the pages from a biblical text into a regular text, perhaps as few as 50 pages, depending on how you align the pages. That means that the biblical author has 2% of the textual space to tell the story of his characters and to narrate who they will become. The brevity of the story is no doubt in large part due to the fact of the writing materials they did not have, the ink and resources they did not have some 2,500 years ago. And the fact that they didn't have as much pages and as much narrative space to write as much as they would want forced the writers of this story to be erudite, succinct in their characterization of these persons. Today, I will present my opinion that the biblical writers used adept skill in shaping our perception of the biblical persons, that is, the characters of these stories. The narrative artistry is more masterful than many of us might have noticed. I suggest that if we give care and attention to our reading of these stories, and the characters as they're crafted in the biblical text, we will discern how persons are and are not suited to the roles they fill. More specifically, I suggest that the specific clothing that Saul, Jonathan, and David wore, with particular attention to the weapons or instruments they carry, are urgent objects that were a point of intentional characterizing focus for the biblical writer. The objects they carried and how they used them are intentionally specific signifiers of their roles in this story. The objects they carry are the means by which the Bible characterizes them for us. Well, what did they carry? As you might expect for a king, weapons of war are prudent. Saul had an armor bearer, and in fact he had several armor bearers in the story. Saul had a helmet, a coat of mail, and a spear. Jonathan had a shield, and primarily a bow and arrows. And David, well, David, I will suggest, is characterized as not carrying a weapon of war. David has a lyre or a harp and a sling. On occasion, David picks up a sword, but the sword that he picks up in different narrative is almost always framed as belonging to someone else. For example, he picks up Goliath's sword. Or on one occasion, when David intends to use a sword and picks it up, a woman stops him from using his sword, lest he enter into folly. Saul's spear, Jonathan's bow, and David's non-weapon, the harp, are the means by which the narrator shows what each man carries as a feature of their characterization. Well, let me take a brief pause in my description of the story of David in order to use a few objects and symbols to help us discern the nature of what I'll be attempting to help us see that takes place in the biblical narrative today. As I have arrived today, I am wearing a garment characteristic of clergy, the clerical collar. I do not know the nature of all of you in the audience or your experience with someone wearing the clerical collar, but I find in my routine experience that when a person sees me with a clerical collar, they immediately have fixed opinions about who I am or what I'm doing. I'm happy for those fixed opinions about who I am and who I want to be as I present myself as a member of the clergy in the service of the church. At the same time, though, I want to suggest that this simple tab in my shirt, just a few inches long, shapes and forces perceptions of me that are immediately part of your awareness regarding who I am. Our clothing, what we wear, shapes who we are and how we are perceived and received. In order to illustrate this further, let me just for a minute briefly demonstrate how clothing of a particular order frames our perception. It doesn't take a rocket scientist, the pun is intended, to discern that this laboratory coat represents a particular office. And when I take and I suit it up with a particular object, namely the stethoscope, it should become immediately apparent, and if I were to have my collar off, of course, it would be a little better, but it would be immediately apparent to someone who saw me that their immediate perception of me would be as a medical doctor. No questions would need to be asked. The immediate awareness with the medical coat and the stethoscope is that I now represent a certain kind of person with certain kinds of skills. In addition to the medical coat that I'm wearing and the stethoscope, there are other ways that characters could be characterized. So with regard to the biblical story, let me draw your attention to a spear and a shield. Now I'll be picking up a spear that's from a tribal group of the people of Papua New Guinea. So this is not an ancient biblical artifact. But here is a shield, and of course here is a spear. Now again, imagine me without my clerical collar on, if you would, but immediately standing with these objects, I become signified as a particular kind of character. You begin to assume certain things about who I am and what I will do or what I'm potentially capable of. Now this in particular is the image I want you to hold in your mind. Look at what it would look like, and again, imagine me without my clerical clothing on, but imagine me geared and ready for battle behind my shield with my spear. The reason these objects become particularly important, again, these are not ancient Israelite objects themselves, but the story that we're going to read in particular characterizes Saul with his spear. Now again, you see me with a clerical collar on today, but imagine if I were standing with the suit of armor and the spear ready for battle. You immediately begin to think certain things about who I am and what I can do and what I'm capable of. Keep these objects in your mental awareness as we move forward. Now, before I return to the narrative of Saul, Jonathan, and David, I want to pick up the stethoscope one more time. I suggested a few minutes ago that if you saw a medical doctor with her medical coat on and a stethoscope, you would immediately identify this person dressed in this clothing with this object as a medical doctor. Therefore, you would expect that the person with the clothing and the object would know how to appropriately use this tool as a task of their profession. Imagine with me, please. You have entered a doctor's examination room for a routine examination. The medical doctor walks into the room and begins to process your body's vital systems. If the medical doctor walked up to you with the stethoscope and said, "Open your mouth and say ah," and as you did, they then proceeded to place their stethoscope in your mouth and say, "Bite down on it," you not only would potentially gag, but you would also potentially have a sort of mental gag. And the reason you would have a sort of mental gag is because you would realize that you know something about the use of this tool, this object, that the doctor seemingly doesn't know. A stethoscope is not supposed to be placed in someone's mouth. Hopefully, you would have the presence of mind to request the halt to the examination and perhaps ask about the status of the doctor, since you would know that this person wearing the medical coat while bearing the object of the medical profession does not seemingly possess the competence to use the tools of the profession. I want to suggest with Saul that in the narrative of 1 Samuel, Saul is the bearer of the spear, the sign of his authority and power. And yet, like the fictitious medical doctor who does not know how to use the stethoscope, King Saul does not know how to use his spear. He has the clothing of kingship, but he knows not how to wield power as demonstrated by his failures with this specific weapon, the spear that he carries. And in fact, Saul throws the spear at those who best serve him and the future of kingship, because he throws it both at David and Jonathan. As Saul is sort of, in effect, throwing the spear away from himself, the author of the biblical narrative is giving us an intentional and effective means that characterizes Saul for us. And yet most of us have probably never really noticed Saul's spear, even though it, more than anything else, distinguishes him from David. Well, Saul and David are much more alike than many persons in the biblical text, reading the biblical text, might know, except for the spear. There are incredible similarities for Saul and David. Take, for example, the following facts. Both Saul and David are introduced 3 times in the narrative. The first introduction of Saul is a private anointing by Samuel in 1 Samuel 9. The second introduction of Saul is a public selection in 1 Samuel 10. And the third introduction of Saul narrates the time when Saul saves a beleaguered people, specifically the inhabitants of the city of Jabesh Gilead, in 1 Samuel 11. What about David? Like Saul, David also has 3 introductions in the story. Like Saul, David is privately anointed at the family event in 1 Samuel 16. Like Saul, David has a public introduction as the musician in Saul's court. And like Saul, David saves a beleaguered people, specifically the Israelites from Goliath in 1 Samuel. If we had time, I could narrate to you the detailed precision in these stories and how there's significant overlap in the comparisons, the similarities between Saul and David. Let me give you just a few more. For both of the characters, we are told something explicitly about their, and of course there's way too many verses here for me to list them, but we're told specific things about the name of David and Saul, the genealogy of Saul and David, the kinship relationships of Saul and David, the city of origin of Saul and David, the physical attributes of Saul and David, the military prowess of Saul and David, and the theological judgment made by the biblical narrator with regard to Saul and David. Saul and David are not from the same family, but as we're introduced to both of them, we learn something about their family. Saul and David are not from the same city or region, but as we are introduced to both of them in the story, we learn something about their city of origin. The list goes on. Saul and David share significant narrative similarities in the story. The biblical text itself, and at least so far as I have demonstrated, demonstrates remarkable uniformity in the type of information provided to us about Saul and David. Well, some of you might jump to the conclusion and think, well, yes, but the theological identity of Saul and David is very different, in fact, radically different. And someone might suggest, for example, that Saul fought against God and David was obedient to God, or someone might state that Saul did not do what God had asked of him, but David did. But is this what the biblical story actually says? Well, to some degree, but in 1 Samuel 10, we are told that Saul was anointed by Yahweh as a leader of the people. In 1 Samuel 16, we're told that David was anointed by Yahweh as a leader of the people. That is another similarity, not a difference. Both Saul and David are described in the story as being possessed by the Spirit of God after the Spirit rushes upon them. Note, both of them receive God's Spirit. Both Saul and David at various points in the story are portrayed as individuals who observe and perform appropriate religious activities. Saul offers sacrifices in the stories of 1 Samuel 14 and 20. Saul constructed an altar, Saul inquired of God, and Saul observed the Feast of the New Moon. David also is portrayed as doing the same kinds of things. In particular, in 1 Samuel 21, 22, 23, and chapters 30, David also inquires of God. David seeks the priest for help. David, like Saul, is concerned with his men's purity. For all this similarity, what makes Saul different? His spear. Pictured here is an Assyrian king with his spear, spearing a lion. The spear, a sign of his prowess and power. With this particular image, if you'll see it, you'll notice, of course, that this king, this Assyrian king, and this is from an Assyrian relief, this Assyrian king, approximately the time of the kingship of Saul and Jonathan and David, in these stories. Of course, in this particular image, the Assyrian king is wielding his spear against a lion. Interesting, David will be called from the lion of the tribe of Judah. So even there's some metaphorical kinds of connections with this being like David, although it certainly is different. But hold the image of that king with his spear in your hand, the spear that I've held up, as we begin to move through the biblical text itself. When Saul becomes king, we read nothing about him sitting on a throne nor wearing a crown. In fact, the objects or attributes that we might associate with kingship today are not actually part of the biblical story, at least not as it's introduced to us. Instead, the biblical narrator tells us what marks Saul as distinctive, including his son Jonathan. Now, away from the PowerPoint slides, let me invite you to look at the biblical text as you might have it in front of you. We're going to begin in 1 Samuel chapter 13, and we're going to move through 2 Samuel chapter 1. You'll just have to follow along with me as I rapidly move through the narrative. Where the Hebrew narrator is brief in many details in most stories with respect to Israel's weaponry, we have an extended narration found in 1 Samuel 13, just after Saul's kingship is recognized. So in the biblical text, in 1 Samuel 13, verses 5 through 7, we have an explanation of the Philistine armaments for battle. And then at 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 16 through 22, a very long section of the narrative, we have a longer narration that tells us that no blacksmith was found in Israel. We're told explicitly that the Hebrews did not have swords and spears. We are told explicitly they only had plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles. The narrative, in fact, is redundant when it tells us an interesting mark of the narrator that Saul and Jonathan alone carried a sword, or a spear. Only Saul and his son Jonathan, the narrator tells us, had a sword or spear. The next narrative in the Bible, in 1 Samuel 14, focuses exclusively on Jonathan and his armor-bearer with him in a successful raid on the Philistines. While neither spear nor bow are mentioned in 1 Samuel 14, clearly one only needs an armor-bearer, someone to carry their armaments, when one has arms to be borne. Jonathan, like Saul, bears armaments for battle. In 1 Samuel 14 and 15, we have the use of swords, though these swords belong to the Philistines and the Amalekites. They're also a generalized reference in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 8, that Saul puts the Amalekites to the sword, but this is really used more as a general description of annihilation and not necessarily a picture of Saul with a sword in his hand. So even when the reference to the sword is used, there is no explicit reference that Saul spared persons from the sword, except King Agag, king of the Amalekites. Now you need to remember the Amalekites. This is the one person that Saul saves who he's not supposed to save, the Amalekites. The spear, then, is the demarcation, the object that marked the distinctive difference that was carried by Saul in his battle against the Philistines. And he and Jonathan have armor to bear, borne by their armor bearers. The spear of Saul will become a further factor in the description of his character as the narrative continues. But before we learn more about Saul and his spear, the narrative will weave into the story the character who carries other objects in contrast to Saul's spear. In 1 Samuel 16, we meet David. Samuel, not Saul, but Samuel is the one who shows up on the scene, and he is the one who will come to anoint the new king. Notice in the narrative of 1 Samuel 16, verse 5, that Samuel says that he has come in peace to be with David's father, Jesse. Samuel, in 1 Samuel 16, proceeds to, quote, look at the heart of the one who will be anointed. The youngest, we are told explicitly, was with the sheep, and he comes back, that shepherd boy David, to be anointed that day. In 1 Samuel 16, the narrative sequence is David anointed at a consecrated sacrifice. Afterwards, David, the now secretly anointed king, is beckoned by the attendants of Saul. When David is requested to come serve Saul, David carries his characterizing object with him, namely his lyre or his harp. In the brief narrative, we are told multiple times that Saul has an evil spirit, and yet David, an equivalent number of times, we're told he's carrying his object, a harp, and he plays it with skill, 1 Samuel 16, verse 16. And David's playing of his object, the harp, brings relief to Saul. Saul has his spear. Jonathan, his armor-bearer. David has his harp, at least to this point in narrative construction. The narrative of 1 Samuel 17. David and Goliath could be unpacked in greater detail than I will have time to unpack here. But in the narrative, in 1 Samuel 17, verses 4 through 7, we have a lengthy description of Goliath's weapons of war. In 1 Samuel verses 14 and 15, we are told that Jesse's eldest sons followed Saul, but David tended to his father's sheep. In verse 28, David's brothers deride him as being only a shepherd. In verse 33, Saul notes that David is, quote, only a boy. In verse 34, David narrates his shepherd skill, noting that he struck a lion or bear, though he does not tell us what tool or weapon he used. David notes as well that the Lord delivered him. Verse 38 of 1 Samuel 17 is most urgent for us. Again, 1 Samuel 17, verse 38. Since we have just had David described in numerous ways as a shepherd, with the skill and work of only a shepherd set over against King Saul, who we know to have a spear and an armor bearer, and we know Goliath has massive armaments, both offensive and defensive. In chapter 17, verse 38, though, the biblical narrator slows down the narrative for us. And in slowing down the narrative for us, he describes to us how Saul dresses David in his clothing. Saul, who could have suited himself in his armor for battle, instead attempts to suit David for battle. And yet, the suit of armor does not suit David. And I will suggest with others that the characterization here is not just about whether or not the clothing fits David. That is, the narrator doesn't say the suit of armor was either too big or too small. Rather, the narrative author tells us that the suit is not suitable to the kind of character that David is in the narrative. The Bible does not say whether it fits being too large or too small, but rather the armor had not been tried or proven. That's the language that's used. In fact, it's interesting, the same language of the armor not being tried or proven is the same language that's used in the wisdom tradition, specifically in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 23, where the biblical text says, "All of this I have tested by wisdom." David, it appears, doesn't have the testing of the wisdom of this suitability of this armor. The trappings of armor and the spear are not suitable, I will suggest, that the narrator wants us to see, to the type of person David is, as David is characterized in this narrative. It's not just that the armaments don't fit. They're not suited to the type of person that David is. To emphasize the point, in chapter 17, verse 39, we hear David say to Saul, "I cannot go in these. I am not used to them." He doesn't say they don't fit me. He doesn't say they're too big or they're too small. I am not used to them. At which point we're told, and I quote here with regard to David's weapons, that David had a staff in his hand. The narrative of David's conquest of Goliath is significant and ends emphatically with this note in chapter 16, verse 50. "So David triumphed over the Philistine with sling and stone." No spear, no sword, sling and stone. And if that is not enough, the emphatic redundancy is given to us without a sword in his hand, in case you didn't miss it. The narrative makes it clear that neither the suit of armor nor the suitability of a spear or sword fit the character of David. Saul has his spear with armor, but he doesn't use them against Goliath. David, though, with only a lyre to sing and with a shepherd's staff and a shepherd's sling, marches to battle with confidence of the Lord's deliverance. 1 Samuel 16, verse 37. Again, time here does not permit a full exposition of the details, but let me note some of the other highlights of the stories as we move through the history of David's rise. 1 Samuel chapters 18 through 19 move us forward, emphatically with Saul and spear, and David with his harp, Jonathan with his bow, which will be more emphasized in 1 Samuel chapter 20. The bow is preeminently the object that will characterize Jonathan for us. It's his weapon, though the bow will never be drawn against David. In 1 Samuel 18, verses 10 through 11, we're told again, Saul has his spear, David has his harp. Here, though, the narrative takes a decisive twist that will become important for how the principal characters are characterized in this story for us. Saul, with his sword of offensive weaponry, who did not use it on the battlefield with Goliath, nor did David, Saul in chapter 18 now uses his spear. But it's not against Goliath. It's not against Philistines. It's not against Amalekites. Saul instead uses his spear to hurl at David. And they're not on the battlefield. They're in a house. This is not where spears should be thrown. And for those of you who have little children, let me make sure you know that. No spears allowed in the house. Maybe for you. This is not where spears should be used. The spear, which is Saul's weapon of war, is used in his house, chapter 18, verse 10, not on the battlefield. And it's thrown against David, who is only playing the harp to soothe Saul. We would expect David to have fled immediately. At least I would have. I don't know about you, but if someone was throwing a spear at me, I think I would have left the room. But David does not. David continues playing, such that Saul throws a second time at David. Now, I want you to note in the narrative, chapter 18, verse 11, David eluded him twice. The scene should be noted for its comedic elements. The spear should not be thrown in the house against the inhabitants of one's house. But that's the only place Saul knows how to ineffectively use the tools of his trade. Saul carries the spear not on the battlefield, but in his house. He can't even use it correctly within his kingship. Meanwhile, David keeps playing along. One should imagine here, depending on your history, Tom and Jerry cartoons or Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. Tom can never catch Jerry, and the Wile E. Coyote can never catch the Roadrunner.
And in the same comedic element, I want you to imagine the way the narrator of the biblical text is characterizing Saul for us. He's wielding his spear in his house, and David's sitting there strumming it. It doesn't even say he ran away. Saul is just so bad at his aim, he doesn't hit him sitting there playing. It's comedic in its presentation for us, and we have to see the way the narrator has crafted this for us. In 1 Samuel 18, verse 11, as I've said, David eludes him twice. Saul throws, and David, perhaps playing with the false marksmanship of Saul, David is successful in just carrying on with his singing. Saul's failure to use his spear correctly in his own house at a short distance. It's no wonder David has slain his tens of thousands and Saul has not. Saul quite literally misses the mark. Again, time and space do not allow for more, but let me highlight several other features in the narrative. In 1 Samuel 19, Saul is yet again carrying his spear, 1 Samuel 19, verse 9, yet again throwing it at a harp-playing David. 3 times in 2 chapters in this short narrative, Saul with his spear misses his mark, and David has only harp in his hand. In the next narrative, 1 Samuel chapter 20, the biblical narrator describes Jonathan's adept skill with the bow. Now notice, we've moved here to Jonathan with his bow. Jonathan is adept at using his bow. He's an expert marksman, such that he can tell you exactly whether or not he will shoot his bow and arrow before or in front of the stone. The entire narrative of 1 Samuel 20 characterizes Jonathan and his bow, and Jonathan is skillful, unlike Saul. Jonathan is skillful in the use of his weapon, though Jonathan does not draw his bow and vault it aloft in order to hurt someone, but in order to act as an agent of redemption with his friend and partner, David. Before that episode comes fully into form in 1 Samuel 20, the narrator has yet another episode for us with Saul, with the characterizing object of his power, his spear. Saul's spear was unused in the narrator's description by Saul on any battlefield. Saul never uses his spear on the battlefield, but he consistently throws it in his house, and now even against his own son, Jonathan, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 33. Yes, a 4th time, and now against his own child, Saul's spear dominates the scene. Though it is used as an object, I will suggest, to discredit anything of Saul's dominating ability. Saul is ineffective and a misuser of his spear in something akin to the fictitious medical doctor I described earlier. Saul had a spear, but he knew not how or when to use it. And when he used it in the wrong place, he did so ineffectively, missing his aim. He's quite literally off target. We know that a doctor who knows not how to use a stethoscope is ineffective. Yet perhaps many of us in the room have overlooked Saul's misuse of his primary object and his demarcating object, his spear. Jonathan wields his weapon, his bow, with effective precision and perfect aim, only Jonathan does not use his weapon against someone, but for the protection of someone. As 1 Samuel 20 narrates, Jonathan's use of a bow and arrow to shoot beyond the stone, David is hiding on the other side such that Jonathan can deliver David. Jonathan sends David, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 42, in peace, much as Samuel had greeted David's father, Jesse, in the words of peace from 1 Samuel 16. Saul wields his weapon, his spear, with an evil spirit to hurt, and he misses the mark. Jonathan draws his weapon, his bow, in peace to demonstrate love, and is precise in his aim of kindness. There is yet more that could be said. David, in 1 Samuel chapter 21, will pick up a sword, but it's the sword of Goliath. So that when David is characterized with a sword in his hand, it is not his own. David, as it were, doesn't own a sword. If he needs one, he has to borrow one, since he's only been characterized with a sling and a harp. To be fair, I do need to tell you that in the narratives that come at the end of 1 Samuel, in the chapters 20 and beyond, we do know that there are scenes where David does pick up a sword. But when David picks up a sword, he wields it against Israel's enemies, the Philistines. And in another scene, when David might have a sword in his hand, the biblical text does not make clear in 1 Samuel 24, David does not use his sword to kill Saul, as his men want him to. Instead, he only uses it to cut off the corner of Saul's robes. So in the few scenes where David has a sword, he doesn't use it in a violent way. And one other scene, in 1 Samuel 26, David steals Saul's spear. Think of the irony. The one object that characterizes Saul's strength, David takes away from him, only, by the way, to return it back to him. Since this spear will not characterize David, it must not remain in his hand. David is characterized with the spear, but he's characterized as giving it back to him. 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 22. Here is your spear, O king. The one object that should be in Saul's hand is in David's. And yet, the narrative definitely has David still calling Saul king, even with his ineffective use of his weapon of war. In one more provocative scene where David does carry a sword and intends to wield it, 1 Samuel chapter 25, against Nabal, the narrator crafts a polished scene where a woman stops David from wielding his sword. And David praises both her and God for saving David from blood guilt. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture of David never having a weapon of war in his hand, but I do want you to see that when he has one, it's not his, and he often is characterized as not actually using it. The final scenes of the episode, 1 Samuel chapter 30, 31, and 2 Samuel 1. David is far removed from the battlefield where Saul will die, and again, with more than we can share here, the narrative descriptions of Saul's death, that is, the way the narrator has crafted the story for us, is entirely framed around Saul's spear, the object that characterizes his kingship. 1 Samuel 31 highlights the focus of the scene, much like a Hollywood film. The fight scene slows down with the narrative equivalent of what happens in a modern film, the slow motion battle scene. 1 Samuel 31, Saul is in the heat of battle, and yet the narrator wants us to know he has time to have a conversation with his armor bearer, since Saul is in battle with his armor. If we had paid attention to the 4 times earlier that Saul had hurled his spear and missed David and Jonathan, and his inability to keep it by his side when David takes it, we should be worried for Saul as this narrative begins. He's carrying his spear, but we know something about him. He doesn't know how to use it. In 1 Samuel 31, Saul wants to be killed, yet he must fall on his own. The narrative of 1 Samuel 31 says he falls on his sword, though the narrative of 2 Samuel 1 narrates that he was leaning on his spear. The very spear that had marked his uniqueness, which he can't throw effectively, and which he uses inappropriately in his own home, he leans on and runs himself through. His spear, kills him. Oh, the irony. Saul is only effective with his sword in his own death and demise. If the narrative irony isn't strong enough, in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verse 10, Saul's body is fastened to the wall. Saul, who tried to impale David on the wall, his body is now hung on a wall. The reader should pay attention to the narrative artistry as I've constructed it, and even use the language of tapestry, as Saul's body becomes a kind of tapestry hanging on the wall. Oh, the narrative skill. What is more, the narrator adds insult to injury as he narrates the last time Saul's spear will be mentioned. It's given voice to the story narrated by an Amalekite in 2 Samuel chapter 1. The very people that Saul should have wiped out are the very ones that narrate the demise of Saul and his spear. The 5th episode of Saul's spear and his attempts to use it against someone, this time it worked. It's only too bad that his spear worked against himself. Interestingly, as the narratives of Saul with his spear, Jonathan with his bow, and David with his harp comes to an end, we read for the first time any reference to a crown or jewelry. It's only at the very end of the narrative that we have a crown or jewelry, 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 10. David, who has not been characterized with spear or bow, now takes to singing, which should not surprise us. For this is the one character in the narrative who carries the harp. One would presume with his harp he can sing, And sing he does at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 1, the Song of the Bow. In David's song, he notes that Saul's shield was defiled and is no longer rubbed with oil. It's no longer cared for. Jonathan's bow did not turn back, though Jonathan's body, like Saul, is broken on the battlefield. The end of the narrative is poignant. The mighty have fallen. And it's telling that the last words we hear from David, with harp in his hand, as he sings to soothe his grief, as the spear of Saul and the bow of Jonathan are broken, left to decay, the very last words we hear from David, the weapons of war have perished. But it's only Saul and Jonathan who'd been carrying weapons of war. The narrative continues to be sure, though it is striking that the last words of David about Saul and Jonathan is their offensive weapons of war that characterize them, namely their broken shields. That is, in the reference of the Song of the Bow, there's a reference to their shields on the battlefield. It's curious that the last words we hear about David in his description of Saul and Jonathan include spear and bow and shield, because later in 2 Samuel, in 2 Samuel chapter 22, David will sing again, and he will narrate 3 times how David has a shield, except in 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 3, 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 31, and 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 36. When David narrates his having a shield, he says, the Lord is his shield. Finally, when David has a weapon, it's defensive only and employed by the Lord. Saul has his spear, but he knew not how to use it. Though he stood with it, he hurled it. It objectifies for us in narrative artistry his failures, his folly, and his falling upon it in his death. Jonathan has a bow, used with great skill, but not to hurt anyone, and instead used to demonstrate kindness and protection for and with David. David, by and large, in the narrative, is characterized with no weapons of war, for the weapons of war have perished. If a medical doctor used her stethoscope incorrectly, we would know something about her as an imposter. While J.K. Rowling has thousands of pages to construct characters for us, the writers of the biblical text have to be wisely succinct. The skillful biblical writer wanted us to visualize and discern David in a particular way. His objectifying marker is not a weapon, but an instrument, his harp. His harp is a tool, an instrument, and that tool will allow him later to produce psalms of lament, thanksgiving, and praise. When the Bible characterizes persons for us, dear friends, we should give particular attention to what they carry. I hope at the conclusion of this presentation that you'll be inspired to read more carefully any biblical narrative. Let me invite you to give attention to other objects in biblical narratives. Moses has his rod and a staff, Jeremiah or Ezekiel with their scrolls, or Jesus with the towel and basin. In the biblical narrative, the object that characters carry and their misuse or use of these specific objects characterizes who they are in the tapestry of stories woven for us in Jewish and Christian Scripture. Thank you. So I believe at this time we have several minutes for those who want to remain for some question and answer on this narrative.
Thanks for this. That was really informative, and I thought really nuanced talk. But I've read a little bit on warfare in the ancient Near East, and I feel like you're giving the sling, you're not giving it enough credit. And in fact, it was really an effective weapon. And I wonder if you could comment a little more about how the sling and the sling staff was actually perhaps way more effective than a sword or a spear, or even the bow, in accuracy and the ability to really bring somebody down in one shot.
Excellent. An excellent question, and of course you're absolutely correct in the way in which the sling is developed and is used in warfare. So let me cite with respect to your question, there's no doubt that your sense of the sling in narratives outside the biblical text and what we know of history was definitely used as a weapon of war. What I want to suggest, though, in these narratives with David, they're not. And in fact, in the narrative where David is characterized with the sling, it's in the characterizing story with Goliath. So when it's taken together with his unsuitability for wearing the other clothes, when it's taken together with his specific descriptions as having come from the fields as a shepherd. There in that narrative, it's not seen as his weapon of a warrior. In that particular scene, it's used as his object of the shepherd. Outside of that one particular narrative, then, the other object that most characterizes David is the harp. And so that's why I leaned into that in the narrative portrayal. But your question is certainly aware and mindful of what other things we know about biblical objects and objects of warfare. But I still would suggest that the way David is characterized with his sling in this story, in the whole narrative, is as a shepherd. And outside of that, he's more characterized with the harp, and then again, less with the other objects. But thank you.
Question about the foreshadowing of Saul, since descriptions are very important in Hebrew narratives. When Samuel is telling the people, this is the king you're going to get, he's going to do A, B, C, D, and E, is there, and it's funny, the last few weeks on my treadmill, this is the very tape that I've been listening to over and over and over again. Is there some foreshadowing at the first time when Samuel is introducing Saul that kind of parallels to this wonderful physical description? We have all these weapons of war. Is there something going on so that foreshadowing matches all this weaponry imagery?
Yes, excellent. And I think the passage you're probably referencing, the reason you can't find it is it's not in 1 Samuel 8. And that's the narrative where the narrative of kingship and the inauguration is narrated for us. So is there a connection? My simple answer would be yes. And the reason I'm going to go with yes is because I do think there is narrative artistry and skill that has brought the entire story together for us. So when I say the entire story, I mean the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua through 2 Kings. And scholars have given a lot of examination to how these stories have come together, what kinds of themes are part of the narrative, etc. To make it simple, but it's part of the narrative of biblical scholarship, is to say that in the stories, Joshua through 2 Kings, there is a pro-monarchical polemic, or a series of stories that are positive about kingship, and then there's an anti-monarchical polemic, or stories that are against kingship. And then scholars have debated, why do you have both? And why wouldn't the final author have, we use the terminology, redacted out, taken out portions of it? So there's a lot of complex things that are going on. So with regard then back again to your question, is there a narrative connection? There certainly is. But the narrative connection in different places is complex. So we'd have to sort of look at those things independently of what's going on there. But yeah, there certainly would be connections across the Deuteronomistic history. And there are dominant themes that could also be narrated out for us.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
My mind is now opened as I'm reading even more and to look for these things. And the intentionality
Absolutely.
of these objects, great. What was coming to my mind as I was listening, especially towards the end here and seeing the patterns, is wondering also, as the narrators compiled these things and put these objects, not put them in there, but highlighted
Yes.
the objects of reality, what was really happening here, to make some kind of comment on deserved kingship and undeserved kingship. And I'm thinking specifically of the passage in Genesis where it says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. It starts out, you are a lion's cub, O Judah, you return from the prey, my son. Yep. It goes on there. And I just was briefly flipping back to look at the story of Joseph thrown into the pit. And Judah is the one who sold him to the slave traders.
Yes.
There's this compassion. Reuben was in on it, and then Judah. And, I, without having much thought on this, saying I've studied this, but it really start to think of the deserved one of kingship is the compassionate one, and the scepter that is deserved. There's a description of God in here,
Yes, yeah.
who is really, as you said, the object of Jesus was a towel and a basin. Who is really deserved to lead? Yeah. Who really deserves it? Is it the one that's fronting? The one who is not in heart, but the one who is, the inward appearance, which the outward appearance which looks right, but the inward which is wrong. And David, which is reversed. The outward doesn't look right, but the inward is strong here.
Right.
So anyway, these statements is
That's
finally
right.
okay. All of this going on, and Samuel is saying, here's this spear, but he's inept with it. All of these kind of things, amazing, and yet the one whose the anointing is upon is the one who just emerges. And of course, all this is leading somewhere, and we believe where it's leading.
Now let me comment in two ways on that. So first of all, I don't want to get too much in the Joseph narrative because it's a whole different narrative and there's lots of stuff going on with it. But in the Genesis 37 narrative where Joseph is thrown into the pit by his brothers, it is in fact, not metaphorically, in the text, the last person to speak that Joseph might have heard is Judah. And when he hears him speak, what he hears him say is, let's profit from selling our brother. What's interesting about that then is later in the narrative, when Joseph finally weeps at his brother's sighting a second time, it's actually when David hears that same brother say, I'm willing to sell myself for the sake of Benjamin. So there is a narrative connection in that other story that's constructed differently. The other thing that I do need to note with regard to the David narrative that I've gone through in 1 and 2 Samuel is that we all know that stories are written after the fact. And we all know that as stories are written after the fact, the narrators at the end of this story get to craft the narrative to suit their particular intention. And so you should know that there is a significant amount of scholarship, entire books, written about the polemic of David's rise, the history of David's rise in the succession narrative, and the ways in which I'm characterizing and demonstrating what I would suggest is David characterized with his harp and not with a sword and not with a spear, is actually used by many scholars, and with good, prudent judgment in many ways, that this is really the first kind of political spin. And the reason David is constructed this way is because the spin doctors of David's day want us to read David that way. Now, of course, that's a scholarly kind of argument, and for persons who hold the biblical text as being the Word of God and having been arrived for us in a certain other kind of way, that presents certain kinds of challenges that scholars and more conservative Christians have to wrestle with, but I do need to highlight that's certainly part of the scholarship of this narrative.
So, what's on the final exam? I'm just kidding. I do have a real question. I'm wondering, the kings that were presented within the Bible, like say Pharaoh, for instance, with his rod and staff, are presented as like striking and hitting and stuff. So, and Moses was trained for 40 years in the desert to learn the tools of like being a shepherd and leading the people differently. Do you think that this passage is also trying to make some kind of comment on that? Like, Saul was a person characterized by a spear, but David with the sling, I mean, they also threw the staff in there for...
Exactly right.
So.
Yeah, so the simple answer is yes. And that actually comes back to the last statement I made, right? Anybody reading the story sees the story, as soon as David enters the story, David becomes the character that begins to be on the rise. David becomes the character whose the attention of the narrative is focused towards. David is the character that will receive greater and greater adoration from the crowds. David is slayed his 10,000s and Saul his thousands. So yes, I think the simple answer would be yes, there's no doubt that this is constructing David in a particular way. The other thing I'd say is the emphasis on the shepherd imagery for David is prevalent here. It factors through stories, but we also then get more sort of add-ons to David as shepherd when we get to Psalms, and of course Psalm 23 becomes the most famous psalm, right, where the language of shepherding becomes part of this and it's attributed to David. So what is started as characterizing David as a shepherd in 1 and 2 Samuel continues and is even expanded on elsewhere, and yes, it certainly seems to be the case. The Bible wants us to read David as this shepherd king.